All right, everybody. Hey, I want to welcome everybody that's in, old friends of Steven's, new friends alike, or just exploring comics or the work of Mr. Bissette, recently. So we are so happy to have you here. We are Concatenation Convention. We are where science fiction and fact come together quite frequently. This is the Comics Goes to College lecture series with Stephen Bissette. It's a 9-part series. Tonight is a number one, the first one. So we're glad that you're here. We've had questions. This is being recorded. It will be posted a link to our website, and we will post that in the chat a little bit later. And then we also have um, an email down in the chat currently, and Stephen has been so generous that he said that if for next time, if you had some questions leading up to the next lecture, that he would answer questions or provide some answers directly to you. So if you want to do that a few days before the lecture, you can send that. Format today is as soon as we start, Stephen will just be this is 2 parts. We'll have a break in the middle. I will be monitoring the chat for questions. So we're asking people to stay muted throughout. And then at the break, we'll take questions out of the chat. And if there's a couple of questions in hand, then we'll move on to the second part and we'll have some Q&A at the end. It'll just allow us to go through everything that Stephen has greatly prepared for us. So we really appreciate it. Our website is www.jacksonconcon.org, and it's got Stephen earlier in the year participated in another lecture with us about the Comics Code and about Swamp Thing, and there's also a link to that on our page. I'm going to throw it over to the other professors. I'm just a regular guy, and the rest of these guys are all Steves and professors, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Mr. Tuckey, Dr. Tuckey, go ahead.
Hello, how's it going? My name is Steve Tuckey. I'm a professor at Jackson College. I teach in the math department and the science department, and I am 1/3 of the ConCon group, and my other colleague, Steve.
So,
SAS.
my name's Stephen Albie-Scott, and I'm a scientist at Jackson College. And really, this is a sort of a brainchild of all 3 of us to bring the idea of science, where science fiction and science fact meet, and where you get scientific discoveries, because most of us are nerds that went into science and all started with the comic books and everything else. And so this is a great opportunity for everyone to come together and sort of the meeting of minds kind of thing. So back to you, John.
All right. And I'm in human services, so I'm the odd one here. But that's always been true. So I'm all glad that you're here. I'm just going to introduce Stephen Bissette to you very quickly. You guys know, if you've been following and friends with him, he has been long involved in pop culture, was the artist for Swamp Thing run with Alan Moore, did his own comic book about a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and did some other self-publishing, and currently has a couple of books that have been self-published, and he's got a special project coming up a little bit later in the year, and I think he's been teasing announcements. So, and he's a recently retired professor at the Cartoon Studies?
Is that Center for Cartoon Studies.
The Center for Cartoon Studies. So without further ado, everybody, Stephen Bissette.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for showing up. It's great to see everybody. This is amazing. My thanks to Stephen and John. My name really is Stephen as well. And I'm honored to be in the company of so many Stephens and John, as well as the rest of you. Some of you I know are up at ungodly hours of the evening and morning. Thank you for being here. Follow up on what John said. I will ask that questions for each session be session specific. I'm sure people have other things they want to get into, but we're going to be covering a lot of ground between now and the end of February of next year, and hopefully we'll all be here still at the end of February next year. So I will ask that you keep your questions specific to the evening's presentation and talk, the subject at hand. And I cannot see or hear the chat when I'm lecturing. So that does not mean hold off on your questions. You should post them on the chat, because Stephen, and John are going to be auditing that chat, and they'll be fielding the questions. I have set up all the lectures so they'll run in 2 parts. If there's questions that folks want to ask concerning the first part, I'll answer some of those before going into part 2. And if not, I'll just jump into part 2 and we'll get into the questions after that. I have tried to make all of these talks, both all ages appropriate and at the college level. So there it is. And without further ado, I will share my screen. There'll be a momentary stutter technically as I set up the screen share, and we'll jump in. Here we go. And okay, everybody seeing the same thing I'm seeing? Here's part 1. Okay, the primary theme of tonight's presentation concerns basically how do I go about drawing monsters? I mean, that's really what tonight's about. The group, our sponsors, who we'll be naming at the end of this talk, chose the lectures and also chose the order they wanted them in, but this seemed quite appropriate to October with Halloween coming and all. I'm going to start by covering some of the basics of comparative anatomy and what's involved when, as an artist, I'm mashing human and non-human biological forms. As John said, he's in human services, so I guess you could say I'm in inhuman services here. I love drawing monsters, no 2 ways about it. I have been drawing monsters for as long as I could move a pencil over a piece of paper and make marks on it. And I love drawing all kinds of creatures, both real life creatures and wholly imaginary creatures. And there's a certain science to it, though, especially after doing it for over 60 years. My most beloved project that I had a hand in is the comic that I wrote, drew, and self-published, which was S.R. Bissette's Tyrant. It was intended to be the birth, life, and death of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but the entire direct sales market basically imploded. I did make it up to the birth, and I take that as a sign of success. So I guess I've been a midwife to a dinosaur comic. But I'm still best known for the collaborative work that I did back in the 1980s, and this is probably the work that you know I'll die still being most associated with by anybody who recognizes my work at all. That's the collaborative work that I got to do with Alan Moore, John Totleben, Rick Veach, Tatjana Wood, and our editors were Len Wein and Karen Berger. And the original writer in the series, when John Totleben and I began Art Chores, was the late, great Marty Pasco. Marty actually scripted the first handful of issues that we did before Alan Moore came on board as writer. My approach to drawing monsters is really a love affair, and that was reflected in the work that we did in Swamp Thing. You know, we lost the comics code, and the lecture concerning our loss of the comics code is the one that's already up on the library's website, if you want to check out that lecture. Once we lost the comics code authority, we did not take that as a license to go nuts with blood, gore, and mayhem. We actually embraced the romantic side of the relationship between our protagonist, Swamp Thing, and his girlfriend, Abigail. And really, in a lot of ways, Swamp Thing became a romance comic at that point. So yeah, I love monsters, and I love to express that via the lines that I make on paper, the marks that I make on paper. Now, I come at this now with a certain grounding in some of the classical illustrators and illustrations that were done long before I was ever on this dust ball. And some of those artists are the artists whose work I'll be showing you in this first half of the lecture. This includes artists like the great Jean Granville, who I'll talk about and show you examples of in a bit. But I also want to bring to your attention that this whole approach of drawing monsters really is rooted in the anthropomorphizing of the biological life forms that we share this planet with. If you go back to Aesop's Fables, and this is one of Granville's illustrations for Aesop's Fables, specifically the tortoise and the hare fable, you know, these are in their way proto creatures, monsters, if you will. You know, the anthropomorphizing of these animals, hares, tortoises, moles, and so on, really lays the groundwork for what all of us who love to draw imaginary beings are working from. There's other illustrators whose work I grew up with, whose names probably have never come up in any discussion of my comics works. For instance, like most people growing up in Western civilization, I grew up with Alice in Wonderland, and those Sir John Tenniel illustrations are burned into my mind, burned into my imagination. Now, I'm starting with Granville and Tenniel because what I want to point out to you is the anthropomorphizing of turtles is absolutely key to certain aspects of 20th and now 21st century pop culture. What Granville started with his illustrations for Aesop Fables, what Sir John Tenniel continued with his illustration and his delineation of characters like the mock turtle, continued into the era of the black and white comic book boom when Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird co-created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is a contemporary extension of the groundwork that artists like Granville, artists like John Tenniel and so on had laid decades, if not centuries before. And even if we just look at one group of characters, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in this case, we go from the way that Kevin and Peter approached these characters that they created to the very radical at the time approach that an artist named Michael Zulli, working with his fellow Puma Blues creator, writer Stephen Murphy, brought to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when Michael Zulli proposed to Peter and Kevin the idea of doing sort of an imaginary tale of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set during medieval Japan, and basically presenting the turtles as very representationally realistic looking anthropomorphized turtles. This is like the Akira Kurosawa film that never existed. What's interesting to me is that when the first live action films were made of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the CGI cartoon full-length features that are made now, they were based loosely on the Eastman and Laird turtles, but in a lot of ways, what they did on the big screen was closer to what Michael Zulli had done. Because once you begin to present these characters using full body suits, even with the advanced animatronics and the very sophisticated special effects that were available to the producers, the directors, the creative teams behind these feature films, you know, these don't look so much like the Eastman and Laird turtles. These look a lot like the Michael Zulli turtles. The same goes to any of us who are approaching delineating imaginary life forms. In another way, we can go back further to Paleolithic cave illustrations. This is one of the many human-animal merged figures that appear in some of the cave paintings and cave carvings in caverns that have been discovered in parts of Europe. This is one of the illustrations that appears in one of the Paleolithic caves in France. It's not that far off from, this is an illustration from a book that I did with folklorist Joseph Citro, which is the focus of the main body of our talk tonight. There were reports that Joe Citro got from northern Vermont that people were actually claiming to have seen Pan, you know, satyr-like goat humanoids. And when I did the illustration for the book, the Vermont Monster Guide, you know, I'm tapping into those same bedrocks that those Paleolithic cave illustrators were tapping into. Okay, let's talk a little bit about comparative anatomy. When I'm drawing my creatures, and I'm going to be sharing step by step with you some of the stages that my drawings go through on my drawing board, I'm thinking inside out. I am not classically trained in medical anatomy by any stretch of the imagination. However, there are some cartoonists who are. My mentor, Joe Kubert's son, Adam Kubert, actually studied to be a medical illustrator, and Adam's work is very much grounded in a deep, profound knowledge of human anatomy. But let me talk to you about comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is key if you're going to be drawing imaginary creatures, particularly if you're going to be drawing anthropomorphized imaginary creatures. And what comparative anatomy is about is that regardless of what your belief systems are, there are points of comparison in the skeletons of all vertebrates. Certain limb structures, bone structures, they exist either in a fully expressed form or in a vestigial form in the skeletal structure of all vertebrate creatures. Now, what this means is if you can draw a human skeleton, or you can at least picture how the human skeleton fits together, and you can either imagine or get proper reference for the kind of skeletal structure that would exist inside, say, a camel, a horse, a cow, or concoct the skeletal structure of the imaginary creatures you're going to be drawing, a unicorn, a dragon, a griffin, the mock turtle. You can get a handle on how to make your drawings look more alive, look more believable, okay? So point being, with this illustration, each of the color-coded leg bones and foot bones that appear in each of these vertebrates correspond with part of the skeletal structure of our legs and our feet. And a lot of times artists, I mean, I can tell when I look at cartoonists and artists' work, whether they understand what the comparative anatomy between a dog and a human being is. Dogs, cats, horses, cows, it's not that their knees bend backwards, which is what a lot of people will express when they're looking at those limbs. It's that what corresponds with our knee is actually sort of buried in the haunch of the torso, the abdomen, the body shape of these creatures. And they're walking up on their tiptoes. It's not that their legs are bend in a reverse fashion. It's that they're walking on the very tiptoes of their feet. And what looks like a knee bent backwards is actually their heel, okay? So the same goes with the forelimbs, the arms. Here is corresponding comparative anatomy showing you specific bones and how they correlate between a human being, our arms, our elbows, our wrists, our fingers, and the same limb of a cat, a whale, a bat. And let me show you how this plays out in my own drawings. Also, there are nuances to this as well, okay? If I am going to draw a pterosaur, a prehistoric flying reptile, I have to have it clear in my head, what is it I'm looking at and what is it that I'm drawing when I'm drawing a pterosaur wing, okay? At the top is a reconstruction, a paleontological reconstruction of a pterosaur wing. Notice it is not the same as a vertebrate bird wing, or in the third wing down, a vertebrate bat wing. But the skeletal structure does correspond with the comparative anatomy of our own arms and hands, okay? And I'll walk you through how that's different. With the pterosaur, the hand has actually been reduced to almost a vestigial set of fingers, and it's the elongation of what would be our pinky finger, or the finger just inside from our pinky, say a thumb, first finger, second finger, third finger, is elongated on a pterosaur, and that's what the leathery tissue of the wing is attached to. This is very different from the wing structure of a bird, and you can see how the corresponding parts of the hands, wrist, and elbow function inside of a bird wing. A lot of this is visible to you when you're eating chicken, right? Feathers have been removed, and if you're eating a chicken wing, you can get a clearer idea of how the corresponding bones of the arm, the elbow, the wrist, the fingers match up. Third wing down is a bat wing. Bat wings are actually as if you held your hand open, face down, and 4 of your fingers were elongated, the 3 furthest from the front thumb particularly elongated, and the leathery skin tissue stretched between those, and your thumb becomes that little vestigial hook-like finger that we associate with bat wings. And at the bottom is our own corresponding digits for the human hand. So if I'm going to draw a pterosaur, right, I'm going to loosely sketch out the skeletal structure. I'm going to work out the pose of this flying pterosaur. And I'm then also going to work out, and shorthand for a lot of cartoonists is you put an X where you're going to have a black area. So I'm working out with this, not just the anatomy of the pterosaur, but a basic design configuration of the drawing that I'm doing. This was a spot illustration for the Vermont Monster Guide, because there have been reported sightings of thunderbirds or pterosaur-like flying creatures in parts of New England, including Vermont. So I work at a circular design, and the circle that's below the pterosaur is my doodle indicating that's where I'm going to put the moon. You know, I love that. This is what the comic books used to do. They'd have those Joe Kubert Tarzan drawings where it would go from stick figure Tarzan to perfectly drawn Joe Kubert Tarzan. I'm sorry to do that to you all. I will present more rudimentary steps a little later on with a couple of other of the drawings I'm going to walk you through. But here's a fully rendered pterosaur done completely in ink. And you can see that I had worked out the anatomy of this creature in my underdrawing, which it should be completely invisible to you when you buy and look at the book, right? When you just look at the illustration, all you should be cognizant of is what I want you to see, which is what the inks present. And there we go. Okay, that contrasts with the Bat Boy that I had to draw for the Vermont Monster Guide, and I'll come back to the Bat Boy a little later in this talk. And as you can see, I designed the illustration so that those extended fingers that actually are part of the anatomical structure of real life bat wings were emphasized, and emphasized in a way that even a casual young observer looking at these two illustrations in the same book might grasp some of the fundamental differences between how a pterosaur wing functions and how a bat wing functions. If they don't grasp it, no problem. Part of why an artist has to give this kind of attention to their work is unconsciously, we know when we look at something that's based on a living creature, unconsciously we recognize whether it looks believable or not. So to me, it's important to work out all this anatomical stuff because I want you in a glance to believe this thing could be real or that it looks representationally real. Now, we can get into all kinds of aspects of comparative anatomy, including the comparative anatomy of the layers of muscle over the bone and so on, but I'm not going to do that to you tonight. I certainly never inflicted it upon my students at the Center for Cartoon Studies during my 15 years there. So let's talk a little bit about how monsters do not necessarily have to be monstrous, okay? And again, I'll start by going back to the illustrations of the great Jean Ignace Isidore Girard, better known as J.J. Granville. J.J. Granville was renowned for the work that he did in the 19th century, illustrating all sorts of fantasy books with these incredibly believable, detailed humanoid animals. I love Granville's work. And Granville also brought a satirist's eye to his designs, right? He was lampooning what he was seeing around him in Paris and France in the culture of his day. And he was enhancing that and bringing it, you know, to another level of perception for his readers and the people who enjoyed his illustrations in what animal forms he chose to mesh with which clothing styles of the day. And again, real difference between how Granville approached his bats and how he approached his birds, even when it was bat people and bird people he was drawing. One of the illustrators who I grew up with was a comic book artist, the late, great Sam Glanzman. It's really Sam Glanzman's work in comics like the Dell comic book, Conan, Monarch of Monster Isle, not to be confused with Conan the Barbarian. Notice the spelling's different and it was a completely different comic. I really responded to Sam Glanzman's work, and part of what I loved about Sam's work is he brought an incredibly imaginative approach to the design of his creatures, his monsters, his anthropomorphized beings that inhabited these fantastical stories. Sam Glanzman's work really is the work that I copied at the ages of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And this is how I learned the rudiments of not just drawing, but specifically drawing comics. Here's an example of, one of the monster comics I've done for my own amusement. This was for my only online comic that I did back in 2010. I look at this drawing that I did one morning. I was trying to do a drawing every day for this online comic. And I look at this, and when it was done, I kind of flash back to that Sam Glanzman Kona issue that I loved so much as a kid. I'm still doing that shtick. I also think about my creatures from the inside out, and that includes when I'm working up their heads, their faces, their facial expressions. I've literalized it, made it a bit more concrete in these transitional drawings. But if I'm going to draw, an ape man, a Sasquatch, a Yeti, I'm really thinking about what's the skeletal structure underneath that head, underneath that face. I may have to do reference work to nail that, or I may, as I did in this case, just work from my own imagination and my own, feeble grasp of human anatomy. And the end result for me is preparing these kind of finished pencil, ink, wash, brush and ink illustration work. The same goes if you're working with imaginary creatures who are shapeshifters. If you're working with creatures that are shapeshifters like a werewolf, you've really got to get a bit more specific about how that comparative anatomy works. What is it that is changing? That's part of the reason that if you were around during the 1980s, when there was that revolution in cinematic special effects, where suddenly for the first time, instead of watching an actor like Lon Chaney Jr. going through a transformation with a series of lap dissolves on the screen, where a makeup man was trying to build up on an actor's face canine characteristics or wolf-like characteristics, we were seeing for the first time in films like The Howling, where makeup expert Rob Bottin, or in films like An American Werewolf in London, where makeup expert Rick Baker, were really thinking through and showing audiences how a transformation would work. And what they were doing is they were applying these comparative anatomy skills that I'm talking to you about now, step by step, rendering a werewolf and preparing a finished illustration for the Vermont Monster Guide in this case. I also try to come up with poses and with action that looks casual. A lot of cartoonists who love to draw monsters will only draw them in some sort of exaggerated action pose. And to me, what brings these creatures to life is the sort of casual observational moments that are the ways that we see living animals in the wild, in the real world, right? Unless you're a deer hunter, you don't go following white-tailed deer around the woods. We tend to only see them if they wander into our backyard, or we're driving down a stretch of road and there they are in our field of vision. And when we catch animals at those moments, we are seeing them involved in some sort of banal activity that's part of their day-to-day survival. In this case, I wanted to do a Sasquatch drawing that had the feeling of you would just come around a corner or a bend in a river and you happen to catch a glimpse of one of them hunkered down, taking a drink out of a river. Now, I work out the drawing, but I've already worked out in my sketch form that I want to have him kneeling in water, and I give myself an indication of the reflections. And if you notice, where I put a lot of care and detail into the brushwork and in a moment, the pen work, to catch the textures of this Sasquatch as he's hunkered over drawing, the actual brushwork that goes into indicating the reflection of the water is very loose. It should be loose, because if I put a lot of attention at the reflection, your eye would go to the bottom of the drawing. I want your eye to go to this creature's eye. I want you to make eye contact with these creatures that I'm drawing. And that's something that my mentor, Joe Kubert, taught me. Joe taught me that it's very important in a drawing that there's either eye contact between characters in the drawing with one another, or eye contact with an object that's important to the storytelling, or direct eye contact with the viewer, with the reader. And that's something I really have taken to heart, and it's key to my approach to all the drawings that I do. Okay, I also want to talk a little bit about, if you're going to be dealing with these kind of human animal forms, creating monsters, there's many, many, many artists who came before us, and there's also many, many, many writers who came before us. And if you're looking to ground your work in a knowledge of what came before, keep an eye out as well for how artists in working in different media have interpreted the works of certain writers. For instance, one of the classics of human-animal hybrid forms is H.G. Wells' 1896 novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau. There are almost countless illustrated editions of The Island of Dr. Moreau. Here is Charles Robert Ashby's illustration for the first edition of The Island of Dr. Moreau. And you can see here how he has delineated 3 of the animal-human hybrids that Dr. Moreau created. Later on, as you move into the 20th century, artists like Frank R. Paul, who was the primary artist for the Amazing Stories science fiction pulp, did his illustrations of The Island of Dr. Moreau. But if you're a monster kid like me, I was born in 1955, it's more likely that rather than these illustrators, you grew up with the movie version, which was The Island of Lost Souls from 1932. The amazing thing is, fantastic as the human animal hybrids are in The Island of the Lost Souls, if you can go online and take a look at some of the makeup tests that were supervised by the studio makeup man, Wally Westmore, they had cooked up some stuff they wanted to put in the movie that was way more outrageous than what appeared in the film. For instance, this is an early test makeup of Bela Lugosi, better known as the actor who codified the classic incarnation of Bram Stoker's Dracula for film. Here he is in an early makeup design for the Sayer of the Law. Lugosi plays the human animal created by Dr. Moreau, who repeats the law, are we not men? This early makeup was deemed a little too satanic, a little too much like Pan, and they went for a much more lycanthropic, a more werewolf-looking makeup. Some of the makeups that aren't visible on the screen, but do appear in the film on actors who appear in the background are pretty out there, including using actors who had facial deformities, like this fellow, and working with those real life facial deformities by enhancing it with some makeup touches, here the pointed ears, to create, you know, a background manimal. But some of the stuff that's out there in the test photos, oh my God, here's, you know, this does not appear in the film. This is an incredible example of the kind of makeup tests that Wally Westmore and his crew had put together that were just deemed either by the studio or by the censors of the day as just being, no, that's too grotesque, that can't go on the screen. Why am I talking about this? Because when I'm going to be talking to you about working with Joe Citro on creating illustrative representations of creatures that people actually report having seen in the real world, a lot of times I have to throw out what I've seen before, right? Joe Citro discovered that there were reports of a pig man, meaning a humanoid pig-like being in Northfield, Vermont. This is the pig man who appeared in The Island of Lost Souls. And it took me some time to get this image out of my head so that I was drawing a fresh approach to the pig man. I wasn't just redrawing what I had seen when I was a kid on TV. Granville also meshed forms that don't go together as easily, if you will, as you know, mammals meshing with human beings. Granville did some wonderful illustrations of fairy tale-like anthropomorphized insects. So did cartoonists like Harrison Cady. Harrison Cady is one of my all-time favorite American cartoonists from the early 20th century. And he drew just amazing beetle people and bee people and fly people and butterfly people and spider people and so on. When I was working on designing some characters for a project where I was collaborating with another artist, a terrific artist named Kenny Wajaja, who was one of our students and now alumni from the Center for Cartoon Studies, we were playing with matching some forms of beetles and insects with aspects of Egyptian mythology. Kenny Wajaja's designs, and I'm sharing that with you here now, these are just terrific. I love these designs. They're very uniquely in Kenny's own style. And what we ended up doing is Kenny would prepare some drawings and then I would riff on them with my drawings. And that's part of the fun of working collaboratively. This is a lot of how John Toddleman and I ended up designing creatures for Swamp Thing over the 2-3 years that we collaborated on that comic book for DC Comics. Now, again, you would think with insect forms that we're not talking anymore about comparative anatomy, right? We do not have anything that corresponds with an antenna. We don't have anything that corresponds really with the specific wing parts of an insect like a butterfly or a moth. But that's not entirely true. In fact, the metamorphosis that many insects go through is fertile ground for playing with what stage of a life form are you going to be turning into your imaginary creature. I'm one of those kids that from the time I was allowed to go outdoors with a jar with a lid, I was catching butterflies, moths, caterpillars, and studied these for hours and hours and hours when I was a kid. And then I let them go while they were still alive. And there are specific comparative and anatomical points between the anatomical structures of all of these beings in their larval form as well as their adult form. Also, they go through a transmutation inside, invisible to our eyes, inside the cocoons that is fertile ground for playing with your imagination. Also, moths, butterflies, you know, these seem very non-human in one way, but man, they have amazing faces, just amazingly, bizarrely expressive faces. That's part of the reason that some classical pop culture characters like, you know, if you're a fan of the Godzilla movies, Mothra. Mothra as the adult, the flying moth, is a great mythological character, but there's a reason that more screen time has gone over the decades to the larval form of Mothra. When I was working with Dark Horse briefly, the year I left Swamp Thing, and I was working with Dark Horse Comics on a proposed Godzilla project, for a brief month and a half, I was redesigning all the Toho monsters. This was sort of my take on Mothra. And then we were told, no, we can only use Godzilla. We can't use any of the other Toho creatures because they each had to be licensed individually and it would have been too expensive to include them in the comic. But it was fun to play with these, you know, monsters I'd grown up with. If you want to get down to the basics, just figure out where the head, thorax, and abdomen of these invertebrates are and extrapolate from that. Use that to humanize them or to make them relatable to your reader or your viewer in a way that is more expressive to you as an artist. Again, look to the writers as well as the artists. You know, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. A lot of artists and cartoonists have worked with Kafka's Metamorphosis. If you've never read The Metamorphosis, it's about a man, Gregor, who wakes up one morning and he's turned into a cockroach. Here's Peter Cooper's take on The Metamorphosis, but my favorite happens to be my friend Bob Sikoriak's take, where he reinterpreted Kafka's Metamorphosis as if Charles Schulz had drawn Gregor's transformation in this peanut strip that never existed. The Fly is another monster character that I grew up with. The Fly originally appeared in a short story that was published in Playboy magazine in 1957. Here's an interpretation of The Fly by Japanese cartoonist Tatsuya Morina. Why has he included some of the structures here? Well, let me explain to you why he has. Here's the version of The Fly most of us grew up with. This is the makeup by Ben Nye that the actor Al Hedison, later known as David Hedison, wore in the 1958 full-color 20th Century Fox film The Fly. But in the short story by George Langling, when the scientist comes out of the teleporter that has mashed his atoms up with the molecular structure of a fly, earlier in the story, he lost his cat. He put his pet cat Dandelo in the matter transporter. So when he comes out of the transporter, he's not just half fly, half human. He's part cat, part fly, part human. And I love playing with that. This is from my sketchbooks. You know, when I'm just doodling in my sketchbooks or playing around, a lot of times I'll go back to these classical monster forms and reinterpret them in different ways. And the Fly is always fun to play with because he's so different in the original short story than any of the film versions. And then, of course, David Cronenberg took it to a whole new level in the 80s. Why am I blabbing on about this? Because if you're a fan of Swamp Thing, you know that we played with anthropomorphizing invertebrate forms when we did our pre-Alan Moore run on the book. This is the double-page splash from Swamp Thing number 19, pencils by yours truly, inks by John Toddleben. By the way, the version that you saw in the DC comic that was published was censored, okay? Notice these caterpillar-like women who are spinning silk cocoons out of their mouth parts. Originally, John and I drew them as you see them on the left here, where they had very human eyes, ears, and hair structures. And the more insect-like mouth parts were at the bottom of their face. I was never clear whether it was our editor, Len Wein, who was squeamish about that, or whether the comics code had actually indicated there needed to be a change made. But regardless, we were told that was too grotesque. So John Tottleman altered it in the inks. And John kind of laughed when he called me on the phone. He said, yeah, I'm going to give them eyes like breasts. We'll see if that flies. No problem. That's what they published. The color work, by the way, is by the great Tatiana Wood. I've also gotten to play sometimes with anthropomorphized animal forms in other media. This film was never made, but I was invited back in 1989 to design a maggot man for a regional horror film that didn't get the funding they were shooting for. I was given this drawing by my friend Ryan Brown, who was part of the Mirage Studios crew. Ryan had his greatest success with the Cowboys of Moo Mesa, which was a Saturday morning cartoon show and toy line. This is the drawing that Ryan Brown provided to me. And he had a friend in Ohio who was a horror filmmaker who planned to do the film. And that's what I had worked up for Ryan and his friend. Sometimes I get invitations as a freelancer to work on images where I'm just sort of given a vague instruction and I got to run with it. This was for an issue of an academic journal dedicated to manga and anime that's called Macadamia. And the theme of the issue was war and time. And that theme sort of conjured up this bizarre mesh of a lightning bug with Astro Boy. And collaborating with my friend, Kat Garza. Kat is an incredible digital artist, and I love working with Kat. You'll be seeing a couple of examples of our work in the second half of the talk. And this is the finished cover that Kat put together for my drawing for volume 4 of Macadamia. This was back, I think this was published in 2009. Okay, I'll wind up this part 1 by walking you quickly through, people think of a Sasquatch as being a very specific animal, but the fact is, depending on how you clothe your Sasquatch, and I'm not talking about clothing the way that Granville actually put clothes, fashionable clothes on his human animal mashups, but how you clothe your Bigfoot figure determines a lot about the character of the drawing and the expression and either the warmth or the sense of threat that you're going to communicate to the reader. For instance, I wanted to draw an elder, wise Sasquatch. And I decided if I went with a beard and a hairstyle and a balding look, that would lend a different personality to the Sasquatch than anything we're used to seeing in the pop culture. So I work out the underdrawing, I work out where I'm going to lay the textures and so on. And then once I go in with my brush and ink, this is just brush and ink, I work out some of the primary details and refine them using a bit more brushwork and a little bit of pen. And this is my finished black and white drawing. Now, this drawing was one that I was pretty happy with. We used it in a book project. And then I was approached by a publication that wanted a cover, and they wanted the cover like next week. Usually they want it last week. So I offered this drawing to the Whitefish Review, and the color was done by a fellow artist named Adam A. Blue. I was really happy with what Adam did, and when I was putting together my first published sketchbook, Thoughtful Creatures, I contacted Adam and worked out permission to use his color rendition of my drawing, because I loved these colors, and I specifically loved how the blue eye just pulled your attention right to the intelligence of this creature. And that indeed is the cover of the sketchbook, Thoughtful Creatures. There's another sketchbook that has just come out called Brooding Creatures. And in this case, I was collaborating with my friend John Jennings. The book designer here was Mark Mastel, who also designed Thoughtful Creatures. And in this case, we were working with sort of a Cthulhu-like creature, H.P. Lovecraft's Ancient one of the gods of prehistory, this part cephalopod, being that also has some humanoid aspects. And I just did like a wash and brush drawing in black and white, and John Jennings loved it and ran with it and put together this color piece, and we used it as the cover. I'm best known for the work that I did on Swamp Thing, and I still love drawing Swamp Thing. I will end with a couple of drawings of him here with part one, because you know, not only is this what I'm best known for, but here I'm meshing vegetable forms with human forms, but that would take another entire lecture, which we're not going to get into tonight or at any point during these sessions. Okay, are there any questions before I jump into part two? John?
I had a question. Can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about speculative zoology. Like,
Yes.
speculative zoology has inspired you in any way? You know, Afterman, there was a book called Afterman. I forgot the author's name.
Yeah, I actually have a number of books that are collections of illustrations of speculative zoology of what life forms might become in the future. I love that stuff. It's also central to a lot of the comic books I grew up with, like The Mighty Samson or Jack Kirby's Commandy, Last Boy on Earth. You know, those are just filled with speculative zoology. But it also works in reverse. I really love the work that's coming out right now from paleontological artists, both knowledgeable paleontological artists and amateurs working the field, who are speculating with completely wild revamps of classic dinosaurs that we've all grown up with. And that's another form of speculative zoological illustration that I really love. Yeah, I love all that stuff. That's meat and potatoes to me.
Like, have you ever wanted to, you know, contribute in any speculative zoology book by a science author and a scientist? Did
You
it
know,
ever?
that's a great question. I was once invited to do a speculative zoological book by a scientist, and I believe his name was, and I may get this wrong, I'm thinking off the top of my head, Gordon Grice. And for a variety of reasons, we ended up not doing the project. It had nothing to do with Gordon, it had nothing to do with me. The publisher decided to go another route, so I was out. Maybe someday down the road, you know, when you're working as a commercial artist, you really end up, except for personal projects, you really end up working on where the jobs take you and what doors open and don't open for you. So thus far, I have not had a professional job that would have taken me in that direction.
All right,
Thank you, sir.
this is John. Real quick, there's nothing else in the chat. People are just fascinated by the different things. There's a lot of conversation about what people reminded me of what it reminded them of. The only one I haven't
Actually,
heard.
John, I actually wanted to make a comment about that, because I hope I didn't offend Jim. Because when you were talking about the sort of mature Sasquatch, I said it looks like Jim Wheelock, and I was going to make the comment that we draw what we know, and I was just curious, when you're drawing stuff, and not that you use Jim for that image, but when you think, okay, I'm going to be drawing a bearded Sasquatch with a bald head, what kind of imagery do you bring to that while you're drawing? Does that make sense? Because we
Yeah, it does.
draw what
And
we know.
first of all, I'll mention that I've known Jim now. I mean, Jim and I go back. We met in late 1970s, early 1980s, and Jim Wheelock did not look like the Jim Wheelock of today. So I wasn't specifically thinking of, you know, friends like Jim Wheelock or my friend Alan Goldstein or even Alan Moore when I was drawing that Sasquatch. I was really extrapolating on, you know, there are certain characteristics. You know, if you're going to draw a child, there has to be a certain proportion of eyes to facial features, and the forehead becomes very important. But if you're going to draw an older individual, it is easiest to tag them as being older by working with certain anatomical details. And that includes cartooning shorthand like balding or bald, beards, and so on. As I'll be talking, you know, the next talk, I'm going to be sharing some ghost stories with all of you. And I hope you can join us for that next talk later this month. And there's one instance there, I won't give it away here, but there's an instance there of a story where I only had a panel or two to sell a character to the reader. I had to show a character to the reader, and I had to make sure that there was certain cartooning shorthands at play there that a reader would unconsciously identify with that character in a way that would have been hard for me to work out if I had been drawing in a more realistic or representational manner. So I cheat, right? Like a lot of cartoonists, I use the kind of shorthand that we use as cartoonists. And that's true with that older Sasquatch that I drew. If you want to make a Sasquatch, in this case, look old and wise, I think the characteristics I choose, including the way he's sort of stroking his beard a little bit with his fingers, you know, that communicates age, wisdom, or a contemplative, meditative look, if nothing else. So I don't specifically, if I base specific drawings on specific people, I'll usually name them in my signature, you know. I'll say, you know, after so-and-so. Or if I do a drawing that's a spin on Bernie Wrightson's, one of Bernie Wrightson's Swamp Things, I'll usually credit Bernie by name in my signature. But usually I'm just working from the kind of archetypes that we all have in our head. You know, we recognize certain characteristics, and there's a shorthand, a kind of personality profiling, if you will, that we apply to our visualization of any other person or character or being. And that's what cartoonists use. That's a lot of the art of cartooning right there.
Hey, Stephen, I'm just going to tell you there is nothing else in the chat, just lots of good.
Okay, let's go with it, because
interest.
I know I'm running, you know, we're already almost up to our 1 hour mark, and I'm just launching into part 2. If you all can stay with me, I will make this worth your stay, and we'll go now. So applying that comparative anatomy and some of those basics that I've just shared with you, let's get into what my process was when I got to work with an actual folklorist, my good friend Joseph A. Citro. He's a writer. He was a novelist when I first met him. And Joe began carving out a field for himself, writing, he didn't call them nonfiction. He called them books that might not be fiction. Collections of New England and often Vermont-centric, our native state for both Joe and I, folklore, including, in this case, researching monsters. You wouldn't think it in a tiny little state like Vermont. We are bigger than Rhode Island and Delaware, by the way. You wouldn't think it, but Vermont has actually had a fair number of sightings historically of strange creatures, beings, monsters, and what have you. In fact, when Joe Citro and I started work on this project, we were worried that we might not find enough monsters. And the problem we had the further we got into it is we had too many monsters. We were still adding entries right up to the deadline of delivering the book. The most famous monster in my home state of Vermont is without a doubt Champ, the Lake Champlain monster. In fact, we have sports teams, we have potato chips. There's probably a bus line named after Champ for all I know. But there are many, many, many other creatures that have been reported in and around the state. Now, Joe Citro and I, Joe's a bit older than I am, but we both grew up with some of the same books. For instance, we both grew up reading the books of Charles Ford. Wild Talents, Lo, The Book of the Damned, New Lands. These were a quartet of books by a man who decided that what was left out by academic science might be more important than what is recognized by academic science. And he wrote this quartet of books that basically laid out the bedrock for what has become not just the study of Fordian phenomenon, but also entire fields of study, including ufology, cryptozoology, and so on. I wasn't so much exposed to this, but Joe Citro grew up reading Fate magazine, which was the first magazine dedicated specifically to unusual phenomenon. It was founded by a very odd character named Ray Palmer, who had started as a writer and editor of science fiction pulps, who once the first publicized reports of UFOs, which the newspapers coined as flying saucers, hit the newspapers in 1947, Palmer decided, hey, this is relevant to the science fiction field. And as more and more reports were published in magazines and newspapers around the world, Ray Palmer decided to launch an entire magazine dedicated to unusual phenomenon, psychic phenomenon, sightings of ghosts, reports of UFOs, reports of unidentified beings and monsters, and so on. Like Joe Citro, though, I did grow up with these paperbacks. Paperbacks by writers like Frank Edwards and Brad Steiger were everywhere on paperback racks when I was a kid growing up. And Frank Edwards did books like Strangest of All, which were just collections of sort of anecdotal stories about unusual events and phenomenon and sightings. And Edwards also wrote some of the first serious hardcore studies for pop culture anyway, of UFO sightings and phenomenon. You know, I don't know if I was part of the first generation of kids, but I was certainly one of the early generation of kids who grew up with the Scholastic Book Club. We used to get this sort of 4-page flyer in English class every month, and it was an order form for books from Scholastic Publishing. And this is one of the books that I ordered through the Scholastic Book Club in my school. And strangely enough, the abridged illustrated version by C.B. Colby, I still have the copy that I bought from the Scholastic Book Club. And when Joe Citro and I first met, this is one of the things we bonded over. We both really loved this book. There were a lot of paperbacks that I could talk about, but I'm just going to hit you with a few covers. Ivan T. Sanderson was a real world naturalist. He was a recognized authority as a naturalist, and he was one of the first scientists to risk his credentials by beginning to write articles for various magazines, including men's magazines like True and Argosy, about unidentified beings and creatures that were out there. This, as you can imagine, eroded Sanderson's credibility as a naturalist, but it turned into an entire field of study that we now call cryptozoology. And Ivan T. Sanderson was one of the pioneers of cryptozoology. And these two books, published by Pyramid, which came out in the early and mid 60s, were essential texts for a weird little kid like me. Sanderson also wrote the first book about Yeti, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life. It came out originally as a hardcover book. This is the cover of the first paperback edition, which was revised and expanded. And this spawned the first generation of true cryptozoologists, including Jerome Clark and Loren Coleman. And Loren Coleman is very important in the cryptozoology field. In fact, Loren Coleman has founded and still operates the International Cryptozoology Museum up in Portland, Maine. There's also a lot of, I shouldn't call these junk paperbacks, but I will call them junk paperbacks. There were a lot of paperbacks on Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch, lake monsters, and so on that were everywhere on paperback racks and bookstores and on newsstands in the 60s, and particularly in the 1970s. There was a real Bigfoot boom in the 1970s. There were also, and this is where I'll blur the lines between promising you all ages lectures. I won't go into specifics, but there were actually adult fiction novels involving Sasquatch. One of the first was My Nights with Sasquatch by John Cotter and Judith Frankel. But probably the one I would recommend would be Naked Came the Sasquatch if you're really interested in checking out this field. John Keel may be known to more people than anyone from the cryptozoology and ufology field. And that's because John Keel is the man who wrote the Mothman Prophecies, which became an oddly popular book and was adapted into a feature film starring the American Gigolo himself. John Keel wrote a very key book called Strange Creatures from Time and Space, cover art by Frank Frazetta, by the way. This book is back in print now, not with the Frazetta cover, but if you're looking for just one book to get your feet wet with in cryptozoology, I would recommend John Keel's Strange Creatures from Time and Space. If you're looking for one author to check out to get your feet wet in the cryptozoology field, Loren Coleman is the go-to. Thanks to my friendship with Joe Citro, I got to meet Loren Coleman, and Loren and I have also become friends as a result of that. And I recommend any of Lauren's books. These are the two that I would recommend specific to the subject I'll be sharing with you over the next 20 minutes to half hour. So what was it that Joe Citro and I loved about Strangely Enough? Well, it wasn't just the stories by C.B. Colby. It was also the design of the book. This was a book designed for young adult readers. We would have called it a juvenile book when I bought it. And it had these beautiful illustrations in the book. They were all spot illustrations, very spare and very simple. This is my favorite story in Strangely Enough. It's only a 2-page story. It's about an old woman in South Carolina who lives alone with her dog. And one night she hears this whistle coming out of the woods that are outside her house. And she keeps hearing it. It doesn't go away. It keeps getting louder and louder. And when she goes to open the door to see if she can tell where it's coming from, her dog darts out the door and goes barking into the woods. And she hears her dog yelp, and then her dog disappears, does not come back home. And that's the end of the anecdote. There's no solution to it. There's no resolution to the mystery. And that is why Joe Citro and I really love Strangely Enough. C.B. Colby's anecdotal writing, these little snapshot stories that were open-ended, which made them even creepier and really stick to your ribs kind of creepy. And the beautiful sparse illustrations, which I really was taken with. Joe was too. So we decided when we were going to collaborate on the Vermont Monster Guide, we wanted it to be a book like this. We wanted to do a book about monsters in Vermont that the 11-year-old or 12-year-old Joe or Steve would have loved. There were other examples. One of my favorite Vermont cartoonists, Jeff Danziger, who is now a Nobel Prize winning editorial cartoonist. Many of you see his cartoons every week in your newspaper. Jeff Danziger was originally a social studies teacher at Union 32 up in Montpelier, Vermont, 15 miles away from where I grew up and went to school. By the way, one of Jeff Danziger's students in high school, Frank Miller, a young cartoonist, aspiring cartoonist. Jeff Danziger, before he got into editorial cartooning, did a wonderful young adult book that was published here regionally in Vermont called The Champlain Monster, and it was a kid's storybook that Jeff wrote and fully illustrated using this wonderful brush and ink style. This also was one of our inspirations for the Vermont Monster Guide. We wanted it to have a look and feel of Jeff's book as well. So the kind of work that Joe Citro had been doing were books like Ghost Ghouls and Unsolved Mysteries. That was his first book that might not be fiction. He also did another book on New England hauntings and horrors called Passing Strange. And this turned out to be a fairly lucrative niche for Joe to work within as a writer. He ended up doing weekly radio spots on Vermont Public Radio for over a decade. And he continued to produce books, including books that went into multiple editions. On the left is the original hardcover edition of Green Mountain Dark Tales. When it was issued in paperback by University Press of New England, I got the cover gig. That's a cover painting I had done for the book. And this really marks one of the early projects that Joe and I collaborated on. Joe continued doing many, many books on different aspects of Vermont and New England legends, lore, treasure hunts, and so on. Curious New England with his partner Diane E. Folds, Cursed in New England, and many others. And if you're interested in the subject, especially after the rest of the talk tonight, just go looking for Joseph's name on Amazon, ABE Books, or your preferred book retailer, and order up a few. You'll really enjoy them. I also illustrated one of Joe's novels. His last novel was a novel called Deus Ex. And it's my favorite of Joe's novels. And I did a whole series of duo shade illustrations. And I won't go into the technique of duo shade, but this is scanned from one of the pieces of original art. And though it printed in black and white, when you look at the originals, the chemicals that are used to bring out the cross-hatching tones tend to look brown to the eye. We also collaborated on a map, an illustrated map. Joe and I both love the kind of illustrated history maps that used to be in New England banks. And I actually have a collection of cartoon maps from all around the United States and Canada. So we did our own Vermont Haunts map. And this led to our collaborating on our first book that might not be fiction together, the Vermont Ghost Guide, the first edition from 1999. This, by the way, is out of print now. And Joe Citro, working with fellow Vermont cartoonist Robert Waldo Brunel Jr., has done a new edition of the Vermont Ghost Guide, which I was not part of. When we were doing the Vermont Ghost Guide, you know, I'm a commercial artist, folks. So I think like a merchant when I'm designing these covers. So what would a tourist buy if they wanted a Vermont Ghost Guide? Well, the only way I could have gotten a more touristy cover here, this is the actual haunted bridge in Stowe, Vermont, Emily's Bridge. I illustrated during fall foliage season, and we're in peak fall foliage right now here in Vermont. If I could have gotten a wedge of cheddar cheese and a Holstein cow on this cover, that might have sold a few more copies, but this is as good as I could get it. And we also included on the back cover of the book a number-coded map of the state of Vermont, and each of the stories inside was numbered to correspond with where on the Vermont map the ghostly occurrence, the haunting, had occurred. Again, our role model with the Vermont Monster Guide, though, was different. It was the C.B. Colby book, strangely enough. When Joe and I started, Joe started digging out of his research files examples of illustrations that had been done for some of the Vermont monsters. One of the famous Vermont monsters, not as well known as Champ, is the sea serpent of Lake Menfremagog. Of course, it's an inland lake, so it's not really a sea serpent, it's a lake serpent. That's an actual drawing that had been published in the late 19th century of what the Lake Menfremagog monster might look like. Very characteristic of the cartoons of that period of time. I wanted to bring a more realistic, if you will, a more representational take on the subject matter. So you can see the difference between my illustration here and the classic illustration from decades and decades ago. I also played with the idea, and Joe let me do it just with Memphrey, the Lake Menfremagog monster. Because unlike Champ, when Joe correlated all the reports of what might have been seen around Lake Menfremagog, they didn't line up. It seemed like many creatures might be living in Lake Menfremagog. Now, as one of those kids who used to catch tadpoles and raise them in an aquarium indoors until they were frogs and let them go, and as I got a little older, I'd actually gather frogs' eggs in the early spring, bring them into the house, keep them in an aquarium until they hatched, went through their life cycle. I decided, gee, wouldn't it be kind of cool to draw the Lake Menfremagog monster as if it was an amphibian, not a reptile? And might it be the different life stages, the transformations it goes through that would account for the discrepancies between what people were reporting? There's also some creatures in Vermont history that are pretty enigmatic. In colonial era, what became Vermont, it wasn't called Vermont at the time, there are reports of a creature that some of the colonials called Old Slippery Skin. In some versions of the story, including a story that was published in Playboy a few years ago about Old Slippery Skin, contemporary writers try to make it out as if Old Slippery Skin was a werewolf, a lycanthrope, a shapeshifter of some kind. But Joe favored the belief that it might have been an oversized bear, perhaps even a species of bear that no longer lives in the northeastern states. So I took that approach with my early drawings. Now, in my early drawings, I work on anything that's in my studio. For instance, here's an early drawing that I did, not intended for publication in the book, but just sort of a conceptual drawing. You can see I did it on a piece of crappy cardboard. You can see the ribbing in the cardboard. I love working with those textures, right? Using the brown of the cardboard as the color that I'm going to draw against, and then using whiteout pen as well as brush and ink and pen and ink to sort of sculpt an illustration. And that became the primary impetus for the illustration that actually appears in the book. This is the drawing that appears in the book itself. As I mentioned earlier, Joe also had reports of some sightings in Northfield, Vermont, of people who claimed that they had spotted something raiding their garbage that was not a bear, that it looked like what they were calling a pig man. Now, this is the Wally Westmore pigman makeup from the Island of Lost Souls. This is what my initial drawings look like. And I realized with my first sketchbook drawings, no. I've got to get that out of my head. Like, I'm not drawing the pigman from that movie. I don't want to do an illustration that looks like I'm working from that as a reference. So it took me a little while to do, in this case, I actually have to work through many, many sketches to basically get rid of whatever archetype is burned into my gray matter, into my brain pan, and arrive at something that's more original. All the descriptions were pretty vague, so I had some latitude to play with. How were we going to delineate the pigman? This is one of the early pencil drawings that I had done where I felt like, okay, this doesn't look like Island of Dr. Moreau anymore. Joe asked me to do a drawing of the pigman for the Weird New England book that he did for Barnes and Noble. They have a whole line of hardcover books, Weird New Jersey, Weird Wisconsin. Joe wrote the Weird New England book, and I did the pigman illustration for the Weird New England book. This was my pencil drawing. It was approved by Joe and by the editor, and they wanted a full color painting. This is the painting. Joe kind of gave me a hard time once he saw the painting. I mean, he was happy with it, but he said, Bissette, you're making everything look like a dinosaur. So I stripped down my approach when we were working on our own book, the Vermont Monster Guide. And I went with, you know, people were reporting this pigman raiding their garbage. I mean, that's kind of sad, you know, that's a scavenger. That's not like an aggressive creature that's out in the wild. That's like, you know, a weak, vulnerable creature that's out in the wild. So I worked up an approach to the pigman that was a bit more poignant, that really spoke to me emotionally. And working with, you know, some directions from Joe, he looked at my drawings and made some suggestions. You can see some of my notes here. I put together this approach, which once I realized it, this is the fully rendered brush, ink, and pen drawing that I did. You know, I could have spent a lot of time drawing garbage, you know, soda cans and so on. But think about the fact that in these spot illustrations, I want your attention to go to one place. I wanted you to look at the pigman's face and the sort of melon rind it's holding in its hand. So there's just enough detail to the garbage can and the garbage can lid, and a little suggestion of a split plastic garbage bag there. But the real detail of the drawing is applied to the figure itself. Sometimes Joe had visual reference, right? He had a postcard for the celebrated human calf born in Lunenburg, Vermont in January of 1913. So this was a case where I had like this hideous postcard of what's clearly a really grotesque taxidermy specimen that somebody had stitched together. And I tried to make it look more believably like, you know, a human calf. I will, because this is all ages, I will not speculate what might have caused a human calf to be born. We won't go there. There were also reports in the World Weekly News before they had their celebrated Bat Boy character, who became sort of a star character on the World Weekly News. They actually ran a number of stories about bats being found with human faces. The earliest story that Joe and I found claimed that they had been found in China. The first World Weekly News story we found that claimed that bats with human faces were found in North America claimed that they found them in Rutland, Vermont, in the Green Mountain National Forest, which we found hilarious because clearly that says, oh, so to most of America, Vermont is as remote as Asia or China. So we were going to have, Joe wrote up the Vermont man bat. Here's my original sketch on a colored piece of board. Then I worked up pencils for the final drawing. And we both decided, well, yeah, the human face bat is cool. Let's make it an entire brood of human face bats. And that's what I worked up for my final illustration. Sometimes we had drawings from the eyewitnesses. There was one woman who claimed to have seen unusually long-legged cats haunting this dumpster that was outside of a business close to her house. And she did that sketch of what the cats look like. So working with that, I drew cats that were anatomically believable. They still look like cats, but I exaggerated their leg structures just a little bit, okay? I also looked at a number of books on cat breeds to make sure that there wasn't a cat breed that already had that kind of crazy leg structure. By the way, the witness's last name was Shepherd, which is why her name was carefully stenciled onto the dumpster there. That's my little nod to the eyewitness. I loved working from the drawings from eyewitnesses. This was an eyewitness who claimed that they had found a 1-foot caterpillar. And this was the color drawing that they sent to Joe Citro with the letter describing what they had seen. So I worked up this illustration. And this was sort of autobiographical. When I was a kid, I always was interested in catching insects. And I specifically remember the first time I ever saw a praying mantis in the wild. I reached for its hind end, its abdomen, the way that I caught many, many beetles. And the minute I touched the praying mantis's hind end, it rotated its body around and grabbed my finger with its 2 forelegs. And it was the first time in my little life that I had suddenly been confronted with a sentient action from an insect. And not only that, an aggressive sentient reaction from an insect. And that's what I tried to get in this drawing, that if a kid stumbled on a foot-long caterpillar, if you got brave enough to touch it with a stick, it would be a little more intimidating if it immediately turned around and made eye contact with you. Joe also had reports from colonial era Vermont of what was called a boss snake, an impossibly outsized giant snake. And I pardon the word balloon. This is the only offensive language I'll present in this lecture. So this is the sketch I did. This was the very first drawing I did, and Joe loved it. Our book editor loved it, and I pretty much just did a more refined drawing version of that by bringing the woods more to life. Unlike the pig drawing, the pigman drawing, this was a case where lending a certain amount of detail to the woods, the environment that this creature is moving through, was a way of making the creature look more credible. So sometimes as an artist and illustrator, you might want to be lending more time and more detail to aspects of the environment in order to really ground your creature in a more believable living space. I had done my share of Bigfoot and Sasquatch drawings over the years. In fact, the first comic story I ever did that saw print was a story called Not Yeti that my late friend Steve Perry wrote when we first met at Johnson State College back in, 1975. I, in fact, had illustrated a novel by a friend of mine, the late, great Rick Howdala. And it was a novel called The Mountain King. And since Rick, in the first chapter of his novel, tipped his hand that the Sasquatch in his story were real, I decided, okay, I'm going to put it right on the cover so that the reader knows before they even buy the book, this is about real Sasquatch. This isn't a mystery story where they may or may not exist. And for the Vermont Monster Guide, there were a number of Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. I call them Flatfoot. I figure we're in Vermont, so it can't really be a Sasquatch. This is another approach I took to trying to make one of the Sasquatch drawings look much more aware, much more intelligent than the classical approach to Bigfoot in a lot of pop media. So here's my early illustration. And I was seeing this picture clearly enough that I did a very rough pencil drawing, and then I immediately went in with my brush and I drew this with brush. So then I began fleshing out the environment, right? There are certain tree forms, certain vegetative forms that we see here in Vermont that we're habituated to, and that very prominent among those are birch trees. So I wanted to make the birch pattern on the bark probably the most distinctive pattern in the design. And then working with my brush sort of framed the creature in the shadows of the leaves and the foliage, the shadow on either side of the tree trunks near where he's moving, and then went in with pen, put in more texture and detail. And this is the finished illustration as it appeared in the book. I also wanted to have some pissed off Sasquatch. You know, sometimes people see Bigfoot and they find it pretty threatening. One person reported actually seeing a Bigfoot that had a tool in its hand of some kind, a club or a stick. So I gave this guy a much more aggressive look. There was also a fake Bigfoot that was called the Goonyak. And it was cited by people and reported, but it turned out it was a stunt by a couple of teenagers that they had worked up a monster suit and gone and stood out next to the local route during a rainstorm. So in this case, I wanted to do a drawing that would fulfill the reader's expectation of reading a book like the Vermont Monster Guide, but once you read Joe Citro's account of the Goonyak, you could buy that this was somebody in a fake monster suit. There were other drawings. I did a Bigfoot for the Monster Guide where I really tried to catch the feeling of a wild animal in a wild environment. You know, here's a Sasquatch outdoors during a spring rain, one of those weird clear nights that we'll get in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, when the moon's out, there's a few clouds, and it's actually sprinkling or raining, which makes no sense when you look up at the sky. We also were working in some monsters that clearly were frauds. The Main Street Museum of Art in White River Junction, Vermont, has a bizarre vertebrate skeleton that's partially mummified that they display as a monster dredged from the waters of the Connecticut River. It's actually a cattle skeleton, which still has skin and leathery hair attached to it. But I drew it up as the Connecticut River monster that David Fairbanks Ford, the founder and curator of the Main Street Museum, wishes it was. There are other creatures that don't have names. There were some very strange creatures sighted in Vermont that I ended up being the first ever illustrator to draw these creatures. Some of them Joe didn't even name. He would just describe them exactly as they were described to him. And I would do my best to work up drawings based upon those descriptions. There were others that were more traditional, including the lake monster Champ. The only illustration I could find associated with Champ was from a Harper's Weekly magazine from the late 1800s. This is the actual illustration I found in the Harper's Weekly in an antique shop up in Maine. When I read the story, it wasn't a report of an actual Champ sighting. It was a report of the students of the University of Vermont constructed a fake Lake Champlain monster and put it out on the lake for a weekend. It was a college gag, a prank. But I love this drawing that they published in Harper's Weekly because they delineated it as if it were real. So what does live in Lake Champlain? You know, there's a photograph out there. I didn't include it in the lecture because the photograph is copyrighted in such a way that I would have had to license it to use it in the context that we're presenting these talks. Some of the reports and some of the photographs that exist really make it look like some form of long-necked animal, like perhaps a plesiosaur. That's the classical approach to drawing Champ. Here again is one of my early drawings on a piece of just raw cardboard. The more I played with it, the more I decided, okay, I'm going to stick with that. I mean, since we actually have photos of whatever the heck it is in the lake, whether they're real photos or fraud, you know, they are showing us a long-necked animal form of some kind. So I try to remain ambivalent about what its body might appear like, and just delineate aspects of the anatomy that do correspond with the record. Now, Joe always had an idea. Joe always wanted to do a book cover in which Champ's neck would correspond with a reflection from the moon to form a question mark. And I always thought that was a great idea. And Joe had described this cover concept to me when he and I first met in the early 1980s. And that really stuck with me. So when we started playing with the cover for the Vermont Monster Guide, I reminded Joe, or he reminded me of that concept. And I realized early on that the challenge was going to be, this was going to be a cheat, okay? There's no way in the real world, if you were standing on a shore of Lake Champlain, if Champ came up, and even if Champ's neck arced in the perfect way, there's no way that Champ's reflection would not get in the way of the reflection of the moon, right? So I had to come up with a cheat. I had to create an illustration that would sell a deceitful illusion to your eye as a viewer so that you wouldn't even think about that discrepancy of how the actual reflections would fall on the water. Now, Joe had tried to convince two publishers, not just one publisher, but two publishers. He wrote a novel called Lake Monsters that was bought by Warner Books, and Warner Books, doing what publishers often do, decided Lake Monsters was not a sellable title. And they were in that era of horror novels where it was adjective, 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 noun, right? So they had a list of potentially sellable book titles, and they decided Dark Twilight was a better title for Joe's novel about lake monsters. So this is the cover that Joe hated of the original paperback release from Warner Books of Dark Twilight. Then after the book went out of print, the rights revert to the writer. Joe put together repackaging and reprints of his novels with the University Press of New England. They had an imprint called Hard Scrabble Books of various New England fiction authors. And they agreed with Joe to go with his original title, Lake Monsters. But when Joe suggested the champ neck and the question mark, for whatever reason, they chose not to go with it. This is the cover they actually went with. I've always wondered, you know, could the artist not figure out? I mean, you can see the reflection of the moon on the lake, and this artist didn't cheat the way I was going to cheat. And it may be they didn't go with it because the illustrator just said, no, I can't make it work. It's a good idea, but it won't work once you draw it. Joe and I were both aware of a collection of John Keel's writings that had come out after Joe had his idea. This is the cover of John Keel's Bible of Mysterious Beings. And you can see here, the artist had a variation on Joe's idea. And this happens a lot in the creative field. You'll have an idea that you haven't seen anywhere else. And then right when you're going to use it, somebody puts it out there. I've seen it happen time and time and time again. So we decided, well, this is sort of what Joe had proposed, but it's still not quite what he was picturing. So I worked up a number of roughs and I played and played with the idea. And I realized if I squashed the reflection of Champ, if I made that reflection almost invisible in the water, I could sell the reflection of the moon, indicating the bottom of a question mark design. Enter Kat Garza, my friend Cayetano Kat Garza. I had collaborated with Kat Garza on a number of book covers and illustrations. We did that macadamia cover that I showed you earlier in the talk. Here's the cover we jammed on for a reprint of a French science fiction novel that was translated into Panic in Paris. On the right is one of the many zombie pieces that I did with Kat Garza for Chris Golden's Book of the Dead limited edition. So working with Kat Garza, I took my sketch, I talked about the problems with the design and realizing it with Kat, and I worked up this black and white illustration. I decided I'm just going to do away with Champ's reflection. If I'm going to cheat, I might as well really cheat. And if I work up a book design with the title of the book is going to go over the moon, we can make sure that the reflection of the moon is the more apparent shape on the cover. So here's my black and white illustration. And because I was working with Kat, I left it open for color. Now, when Kat worked up the color, and I love what he did with it, he was really struggling with how to render the texture of Champ. And I had an idea when I did the black and white, okay? What do I associate with Vermont waterways? I was a kid who grew up fishing. I associate rainbow trout with Vermont waterways. And I said, Kat, take a look at the pattern on the skin of rainbow trout. Let's work up Champ with a suggestion of that kind of skin texture. And indeed, we based it on brook trout and rainbow trout. And this is what Kat put together, including these wonderful airbrush-like digital enhancements that he worked up. Now, when you're designing a book cover, you have to keep in mind the art director and the publisher you're working with. So even though this is our finished illustration, we're designing a book that's going to appear in bookstores. And Joe Citro really wanted to have a design that suggested the old EC horror comics of the 1950s, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear. So we decided to reduce the size of the illustration, which allowed us to keep the reflection of the moon clear of the author's name. And the editor loved the idea. Luckily, we were working with an editor at University Press of New England who had grown up with famous monsters of filmland. So we worked with a title design with a variation of the famous monsters of filmland type style. And Kat Garza prepared these little bullets, these circular illustration spaces, and we tagged each of them with a color version of one of the illustrations from inside the book. And that's how we put together the front cover of the Vermont Monster Guide. We also had to have a back cover. And one of Joe Citro's favorite drawings that I had done for the interior book was not for a monster per se, it was for a ghost, a threatening ghost of a child that haunts a railroad bridge. The child is often seen with a sort of spirit wolf or dog. And I had worked up this illustration. If you want to make a kid scary, keep their face in shadow, okay? What your viewer does not see is often more effective than what they do see. And this illustration became a favorite in the book because of that aspect. People would look at this and get the heebie-jeebies, and there's almost nothing there that you're really looking at. So it was decided that would be the illustration on the back cover, and this is Kat Garza's full cover spread design for the Vermont Monster Guide. There's a new edition of the Vermont Monster Guide. The University Press of New England closed its doors a little over 2 years ago. Rights reverted to Joe Citro and I. Joe found a publisher, and a publisher in Texas, as a matter of fact, oddly enough. And my one condition of the reprint of the book, other than how we were going to break out sharing royalties, was I wanted Kat Garza to design the book cover again. And Kat went back to our original illustration, and this is the current cover of the new edition of the Vermont Monster Guide. I've continued playing with cryptids in my professional work. We're winding up the lecture now. I'm going to wind up by showing you one last big job. I have been able to work with some artists you may have heard of. Robert Hack is one of my favorite current American cartoonists. You may know Robert's work from the Sabrina comic book series. Robert, in fact, designed the animated titles to the Sabrina Teenage Witch TV series that's streaming right now. So I've started a series of books called Cryptid Cinema, which are essays written by myself about aspects of movie history, films that feature cryptids, unidentified life forms, and so on. We even included a Cryptocinema poll in the first volume, and that's available on Amazon if you're interested in picking it up. Now, there's also cryptids that aren't in Vermont. And the main one I grew up with, because I went to the Joe Kubert School. I was a member of the first ever class of the Joe Kubert School, entered in fall of 1976 when Joe and Muriel Kubert opened the doors, graduated a member of the first ever graduating class in the spring of 1978. While I was in New Jersey, we took a couple of trips with friends up into the Jersey Pine Barrens to see if we could see the Jersey Devil, a creature reported to be inhabiting the Jersey Pine Barrens. I got involved with, thanks to my friendship with and my professional work with my friend Alan Goldstein. Alan Goldstein not only founded Moondance Comics, he also co-founded and launched the first video superstore in Vermont, which was First Run Video. During my time of working in the video industry with Alan at First Run Video, I became eventually co-manager and buyer. We met a couple of filmmakers out of Pennsylvania, Lance Weiler and Stefan Avalos, and they had made a film in 1998 called The Last Broadcast about a cable access show crew that goes into the Jersey Pine Barrens, just the way me and my friends did when I was at the Kubert School. But they go in with cameras and something horrible happens to them in the Jersey Pine Barrens. And that is the premise of Lance and Stefan's feature film, The Last Broadcast. This film was made in 1998. It was the first film to ever be shown via digital technology in a motion picture theater, a full year before George Lucas's The Phantom Menace. It also provides the template for a film that also came out an entire year later, that almost all of you have heard of or seen, The Blair Witch Project. It basically was a lift of the premise of The Last Broadcast. They both go in very different directions. They're very different movies in their way, but I'm a big fan of The Last Broadcast. Why am I talking about it? Sometimes as a commercial artist, you get invited to work on a job where it may involve monsters, but you're not allowed to draw a monster because the creators of the project, like The Last Broadcast or the author of a book, doesn't want the reader to know whether the creature that the story is built around is real or not. And that's the case with The Last Broadcast. Here's some of the early packaging, not just in America, but also in England and elsewhere in the world for The Last Broadcast. I was invited to do a cover for the first DVD edition of The Last Broadcast when a label called Heretic was going to put it out on DVD. This was about, I'd say 12 or 13 years ago. So I worked up this cover painting in which I'm not showing the Jersey Devil, but I sort of am showing a Jersey Devil lingering over the skyline of the Jersey Pine Barrens. I also got to work with a team of students from the Center for Cartoon Studies and a couple of fellow faculty members, among them novelist Sarah Stewart Taylor and poet Peter Money. And we did a little mini comic that was packaged inside the DVD of the last broadcast, in which I also drew some of the panels working with the students. And this is a scene right out of the movie, The Last Broadcast. Recently, I was invited by the filmmakers to play with some new concepts for The Last Broadcast. And I just wanted to end this talk by showing you the stages I went through on the most recent commercial art job that I have delivered. This was among the roughs that I showed to my clients, plural. Everyone liked this idea, but the problem was I was designing it as a wraparound cover, the way we did the Vermont Monster Guide, the way we had done for Heretics edition of The Last Broadcast. It turned out the client only wanted a vertically formatted, front cover formatted illustration. So I hit them with a few ideas. You know, we could go with a shape and a tagline, or I could work up a new design based on one of my favorite movie poster artists, the great Ralph McQuarrie. If you're a Star Wars fan, you may recognize the name because Ralph McQuarrie was the artist that George Lucas originally went to work up the pitch paintings that were used to sell Star Wars to 20th Century Fox. But I know Ralph McQuarrie's work from his movie poster art, particularly the movie poster art that he did for a regional filmmaker out of Arkansas named Charles B. Pierce. And my favorite Ralph McQuarrie movie poster is that one on the right. I love that Bootleggers poster. That was such an effective one-sheet poster. This was one of the few movie posters that when the movie was playing in theaters and I saw that in the lobby of a theater, I actually crossed the street to go look at the poster because I wasn't sure what I was looking at. And as soon as I saw the poster, I paid my 12 bucks and went in and saw the movie. Although back then I think movies were $5. You may know Ralph McQuarrie's movie poster work because he's the guy that did the painting for the classic The Legend of Boggy Creek. He also did the painting for the lesser known sequel, Boggy Creek 2. And by the way, The Legend of Boggy Creek has just been resurrected, restored, and put out on an authorized Blu-ray by the filmmaker's daughter, Pamela Pierce Barsalou. And I highly recommend that Blu-ray if you love Bigfoot movies. The Legend of Boggy Creek was the ground zero, the beginning of the entire Bigfoot movie cycle and phenomenon. Anyway, I decided to pitch an idea that was based on Ralph McQuarrie's poster designs, where you use the dark negative space of 2/3 of your illustration. But I was going to tweak that. And this is what I pitched for this particular illustration to the client. And I'll now walk you through, once they approve the basic design, here's my original gray wash painting. This is the hardest part of doing the illustration for me. I'm not that good with facial likenesses. I really have to work at it. And this took quite a bit of time to work out. By the way, a couple of these faces are actually the filmmakers, Lance Weiler and Stefan Avalos, and I really want to make sure to catch their likenesses. So here's the first color rendering over my wash piece. Stay with me. Here's the stage where I go in with ink and brush, and you can really begin to see what the design is that I had in mind. Bringing it to the next stage, once I add the figures, the whole thing really comes into focus. I then am going to go in with color pencil. All this color work, by the way, was being done with watercolor and with Dr. Martin dyes, which are these hyper fluorescent, really bright color dyes. I went in with color pencil, work in more detail, and brought it to completion. So I'll bomb through that quickly, just so you can see it. Here we go. Of course, it didn't go that quick when I was doing the job. This took me about, I'd say, 3 to 4 weeks to complete. But there you go. That's my most recent commercial art job involving monsters in which I could not show a monster. Special thanks to the sponsors of this talk. I'm sorry I went so far over our time limit. I'll keep it much tighter next time, I promise. Special thanks to David Fairbanks Ford at the Main Street Museum and Lauren Coleman, the International Cryptozoology Museum. They had sponsored the first version of this talk over a decade ago. And here's some information on my latest published work and new books by Joe Citro, and some information on Kat Garza, my color partner in the bulk of the work I showed you. I will now take questions, and John, Steven, you decide when we're shutting down for the night. Thank you, everyone.
Right.
I hope you enjoyed it.
No, thank you, Stephen. That's fantastic. I've got a couple in the chat that I thought we would start with, and then we would just maybe have, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So we'll have time for 3 or 4.
I'm
But
yours.
first one was from, if some of the students, if they ask questions, I think they're getting some extra credit. So Thayer Cook asked me a couple of questions, but I think personally, do you believe in aliens? And what, out of this kind of material that you've presented about cryptozoology, what has frightened you out of those things? Have you been actually frightened by any of those concepts or films about cryptozoology?
That's a great question. You know, I mean, I was born in 1955, so I've grown up with UFOs and UFO sightings as being, you know, part of our environment. So I have no problem accepting and believing that there are other life forms out there other than what we know of here on this planet. I don't know if we're ever going to see them. I certainly have never seen any of them. I do have a childhood friend who recalls he and I seeing a UFO over the Winooski River, but I do not have a clear recall of that. And I don't know if it's because I've knocked it out of my memory. I mean, there are certain things I remember. I think I remember most things in my life, but I'm always caught off guard by what I don't remember, right? And it's good to have friends around like Rick Veach and John Tollivan to remind me when I'm, you know, beset. In terms of cryptids and cryptozoology, you know, none of it scares me. I love all this stuff. And, you know, I'm one of those people, I've heard really scary noises out in the woods and stuff. I'm one of those people that I'll go look, you know. I would die instantly in a Friday the 13th movie. And not because I had to go piss in the woods. Like, I would be like, what is that out there?
Heads off.
Well, here, I'll give you a real world example. I'll keep it short. When I was a Boy Scout, and no, I was not abused as a Boy Scout. I'll just put that right out there because I know that's in the news a lot. When I was a Boy Scout, we used to do a lot of hiking. And we went up on Camel's Hump, which was in North Duxbury, Vermont. I grew up in Duxbury, Waterbury area. And I used to go up to Camel's Hump. I'd hike up there, you know, 5, 6, 7 times a year. And I was up there for not just an overnight hike, but we did like a 2 to 3 night, you know, stay on Camel's Hump. And there was one night where one of my buddies and I were the ones that had to go out and get firewood. And it was twilight and it got dark as we were gathering the wood. But we had a flashlight. And as we were walking in the woods, we saw something that was kind of greenish between the trees. And my friend was scared, and I was like, no, that's really there. Like, let's go look at what is that over there, right? So I'm the crazy one that's like, no, let's go over there. And it was so cool. We got there, and it was an entire giant tree stump that was overgrown with moss, and the moss was phosphorescent. It was glowing.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I mean, you know, to my knowledge, I've never seen a cryptid. I've certainly seen enough evidence, including places like the International Cryptozoology Museum, where, yeah, I've talked to people who saw something, and those people are very believable. They really saw something. And when you think about it, we're all aware of life forms that really live in the real world that we've never seen and that we're never ever going to come across, right? But they don't frighten me, you know. I would take the same caution that I would with, you know, knowing there's a black bear in the backyard or something like that. Like, you don't go out and mess with a black bear. And if you really want to watch those wild turkeys go through your yard, you don't open the door because they're going to take off. I have no problem believing that something like these things exist out there. whether I believe in it or not, it's just more fun to live in a world where they might be out there. So hopefully that
Right.
answers the question. Hopefully I answered the question.
No, I think you answered it as good as you can answer it. There's two subs, and I'm going to get to Abu in a minute here. We had one of the professors inquire, what do you think is behind anthropomorphizing? Do you think that's a response to the unknown, some of that, or?
I think anthropomorphizing is part of how we learn to interact with the world, and not just the natural world. Look at Scott McCloud talks about in Understanding Comics how we as a species habitually put faces on things, right? You look at the grill of a car, the face of a clock, and so on. There's a reason we call it the face of a clock, right? We tend to anthropomorphize everything around us, and part of it is just as beings, we tend to project ourselves onto the environment around us. But I also think part of it is how we cope with nature. Like it's easier to cope with a world where you think animals think the way we do in some way. But you know, I'm I'm a layperson. I'm not a scientist. I have friends who are scientists. I have friends who are paleontologists. They know far more about the sciences than I'll ever know. But I know enough that I've interacted with enough living creatures that, you look into the eye of a parakeet, and that's a being that does not think the way we do and does not act the way we do and is never going to think the way we do. And if it was big enough, it would make pretty short work of any one of us that was standing around. Um, I don't, I accept that part of my function as a cartoonist is to anthropomorphize these forms because whether it's to entertain you or to catch your eye, anthropomorphizing instantly is a way to hook your attention. Okay. And also, as cartoonists, we use all kinds of graphic shorthand to communicate with a viewer or reader. And anthropomorphizing is absolutely key to that aspect. During the next lecture, which we'll do in 2 weeks, I'll be talking to you about ways we anthropomorphize not just living things like the cryptids I talked about tonight, whether imaginary or real, and not just animal forms, but we also anthropomorphize environments, places. These become characters in our stories, whether we're aware of it or not. And actually, the best storytellers don't let their reader or viewer become cognizant or conscious of it because it works even better if your viewer or reader remains unconscious of what you do. So I just think it's part of how we function as a species.
All right, thank you. This is more just a mention, but Juliana Fite mentions, have you ever heard of the Flatwood Monster from Flatwood, West Virginia?
Oh, I sure have. As a matter of fact, I
Okay.
tracked out, there is a terrific book about the Flatwood Monsters case written by a complete, and I'm not using this in a derogatory fashion, written by a completely obsessed writer who has nailed down every detail, not just of the case, but of the UFO flap, the UFO sightings that happened around the Flatwoods event, lending more credibility to what happened. So yeah, I also would recommend for those of you who don't know what we're talking about with the Flatwoods Monster, there is an independent filmmaker named Seth Breedlove, and Seth and his creative team, which includes his wife, have formed a cooperative of filmmakers. They call themselves Small Town Monsters, and they have done a terrific series of original documentaries, and they have done the best single documentary imaginable on the Flatwoods Monster case, and it's called The Flatwoods Monsters. So easy to find. I highly recommend it.
Straightforward.
And I highly recommend anything by the Small Town Monsters folks. They've done some terrific, innovative filmmaking around these cryptid and cryptozoology cases and certain aspects of UFO and ufology.
Cool. Well, Abu, are you still there? Because you're our last question, and then we're just going to do.
Abu.
Go ahead, Abu.
Hi. So yeah, I had a question about. Have you ever looked at creatures other than America? Like Hindu mythology, for example, like the temples, Khajuraho temples, those creatures that they show on the temples. Like Hanuman and
Yes.
half monkey, half.
And I've not
humans.
only gotten to look at, photograph. I mean, I've never been to your country, India, but I've studied photographs. I have many books on the mythology. My good friend Tim Paxton, who's designer of the Cryptid Cinema books, has visited India, and Tim is working on a series of books about India genre films, fantasy, horror, science fiction films. Yeah, I love that stuff, Abu. And I'm also, right now, I'm really taken with the mythology from the Philippines. I've got a whole series of books that a professor wrote. I think it's over half a dozen books detailing the mythological creatures of the Philippines. I love all that stuff. I rarely draw it, but that could change, if the opportunity presented itself. Part of it is, I have to tell you, this may be obvious from the presentation I just gave to you. Let's say, Abu, that you challenge me to draw, one of the beings from Indian
Hanuman,
mythology.
Hanuman.
Your drawing is going to be better than my drawing because you've
An
grown up with
emotion.
it in your culture. I have, part of my struggle as an artist is it's hard to break the habits of drawing what's familiar to me. Okay.
Mm.
When I drew Swamp Thing, when I was penciling Swamp Thing, I kept making mistakes that readers in Louisiana would write to DC Comics and complain about, right? Because I'll give you an example, not with the animals, right? Because I'm pretty good with research on animals, and I knew what lived in Louisiana, what didn't live in
Mm.
Louisiana, and I wasn't going to draw some Vermont creature that doesn't live in Louisiana. But if I was
Mm.
drawing a car going down the road, I would draw a post and beam fence, and people would write in and say, "Those things rot away in 4 months down here," you know. I ended up making so many mistakes that I convinced my family to take a family trip, and we
Mm.
drove through the Florida Panhandle, and we spent about 2 days in Louisiana and photographed everything we could. Um, so, if I took on drawing some of the beings in Indian mythology, I
Mhm.
might end up with some cool drawings. Some of them you might even like, but they wouldn't have the authenticity of an artist who grew up in the culture, you know.
Mhm.
But I love that stuff. I've got a collection of comic books published in India. The publisher that, in fact, I believe you're interning with or working with, and I've got a number of books, including a couple that my friend Tim Paxton gave me, just on Indian mythology. And I also have been enjoying the films. Here in America, they've begun releasing English subtitled DVDs and Blu-rays of some of the monster movies from India, um, and I love that stuff. I love that stuff. Even when
I
they're
would love
copying our
to.
monsters, like they've got their Freddy Krueger movie, you know.
Mm.
But I love that stuff.
I would love to see your version of Hanuman if you can draw it. I would love
Uh,
to see your version.
okay, that may be something that I get to play with. You know, as I said earlier in the talk, sometimes I draw something because a job presents itself, and I have to draw it for the client. But sometimes I draw. A lot of times I just draw for fun. So
Mm.
let's see what I can come up with.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Alrighty. That is the last of the questions. And I just want to thank everybody for a great night. Thank you for showing up. I've got a couple of housekeeping for y'all. The next part of this series is going to be called Pages, Panels, and Ghosts. It's right around Halloween. It's going to be a great presentation about storytelling and referencing atmospherics and those and environmental stuff and how you make the action go through comic books as far as I understand it. Stephen is also offered as a part of our December show. There will be some signed items that we will be giving away at that December presentation. And in between there, we've got Dinosaurs and Pop Culture 1 and 2. And then in December, we've got Manga Before Tezuka. So those are going to be some super presentations. This was a very rich one. I really enjoyed it. I didn't know how rich it was going to be with illustration and how I really enjoyed that piece of the anatomical explanation of bats and birds and humans. What a cool way to frame doing creatures. Um, this is recorded, and we're about to stop the recording here when we get off. This will have a link on our website. It's jacksonconcon.org, and you can find Stephen's earlier lecture about the Comics Code and Swamp Thing on our website as well. You just have to scroll down a little bit. We're also on Facebook, and we have all of our events on Facebook listed if you scroll down, and we also have them on our website so you can register. Just go to the events tab and go to register, and it'll send you a link so you can register for this.
Hey, John.
And it's in the
Yes,
chat.
sir.
So I want to just make a comment, sort of like a shout out to everyone that came right now to tell other people to come to these events, because we have a really hard time getting the message out beyond our, as Stephen says, except for Abu and a few other people. It's hard to actually get a broad draw because we really only have connections to people in Michigan or in a few of our relatives. So if you can, tell people about this. Let's get the word out so we get more people attending.
Absolutely. And this was a great turnout, and we had over 70 people register for this program, which is a high thing for us. But you can share everything on our Facebook. You can share the events, I think, and you can share the links to our webpage. So, and there's a ton of other content. This is the tail end of our virtual year, which is our theme is reanimation. And I don't think it's too early to tell you, but our next year topic will be Afrofuturism, which will be the end lecture of this series. So thank you so much for everybody coming. Spread the word, especially that December show where there's going to be some giveaways signed by Stephen. We haven't figured out how we'll do it, but if you come, you have a better chance of winning than if you do not. So have a great night, everybody. Really appreciate everyone from coming out. I love this stuff. As a little guy growing up in Southern Colorado, I never thought I'd be on here with Stephen Bissette having these awesome conversations. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a great night.